Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to pick up on you had one property that you were trying for when you were still at Hanna-Barbera.
Yes. In addition to the Marvel properties that I was interested in and trying to do, the other passion, I may have told you that when I lived in Washington as a child, there was a local show on starring Jim Henson and his wife. And they didn't star in it, they were the producers. And of course it was their characters, including Kermit. So I was a longtime fan of Kermit. So when I was at Hanna-Barbera, I got the bright idea of let's do an animated Kermit. So I found out who the agent was, picked up the phone number and called Bernie Brillstein. And Bernie represented Jim Henson. And thus my campaign to do animated Muppets started. And Jim consistently turned me down. He really felt that he didn't want to confuse the audience with characters that are rendered as puppets to now be an animation. And I just probably once a month had lunch with his agent and wined and dined him and did everything. I just was such a fan of the property. Well, I was at the end of my tenure at Hanna-Barbera, I had been offered a job at Marvel to go over as its CEO and president, which was a huge jump for me. And I was very interested in it, but I loved Hanna-Barbera. I loved working for Joe and Bill. They treated me like one of their children, and they were so kind and so generous and gave me a lot of leeway. And I had a huge staff and a great staff, talented staff. So I was really debating what to do at the time, and I finally, my secretary one night opened the door and looked at me, and I had my head in my hands, and I was sitting at my desk, and she knew I was contemplating leaving the company and to take this job. And she said, "I have one thing to say to you." And I said, "What's that?" She says, "Comfort doesn't mean growth." And then I knew I was going to take the Marvel job because I was comfortable, but I wasn't necessarily growing anymore. So I accepted the job. And I left Hanna-Barbera thinking I'll never be able to do Jim Henson's Muppets, but I'll have to give up that dream because now I'm going to Marvel. And no sooner was I at Marvel than I got a phone call from the network executive, Judy Price, who was in charge of children's programs at CBS. And she and I had become friends, and of course she was a client. We were doing a lot of shows for her. And Judy said to me, "Margaret, I thought of you because I was just flying back from New York, and in one of the magazines, like Licensing Magazine, there was a picture of the Muppets from the movie Muppets Take Manhattan." Excuse me, I just have to, okay, let me see. There was a picture of the Muppets, and they were dressed as babies. They even looked like babies, and it was a dream sequence when Kermit and Piggy and the Muppets Take Manhattan were going through Central Park in a buggy and as babies. And she said, "I know you've always wanted to do Muppets, but what if you did something called the Muppet Babies?" I said, "That's a fabulous idea. Maybe Jim will accept that." So the rest is history. I was now at Marvel, and I called up Bernie Brillstein again, who had me set up lunch with Jim Henson, whom I had met previously, but he had been unswayed. And we talked to him about how about if we do Muppet Babies, that CBS would like the show, and we could produce it at Marvel. I know it's not a Marvel character, but Marvel is a good animation studio. And Jim said, okay. And that began a great relationship I had with Jim for all the years I was at Marvel, 6 years. We produced Muppet Babies. We won 4 Emmys, or maybe more than 4. I think yes. But it was a wonderful experience. And everything that we had wanted to do with the Muppets, we could do with Muppet Babies. You know, the concept was that they were babies in a nursery, and you never saw the nanny who took care of them. You only saw her feet. But to get out of the nursery, they would have these fantasy adventures. And so everything we would want to do with the Muppets, we were able to do because was better than having the Muppets, because kids using their imagination and dreaming about adventures, which we would then animate, works better for the baby characters than the adult characters. So we had a great run, and it was very successful. And I really have to thank not only Jim Henson, but Judy Price for coming up with seeing that little picture and getting the idea of, oh, wait, Margaret's been trying to get the Muppets. She could do Muppet Babies.
And what do you think made Jim Henson go for it?
Well, I know specifically what he said to me was he thought that kids would not be confused when they saw a live-action Kermit, but a Kermit baby as animation wouldn't be confusing to them. He was always concerned about confusing the audience. Jim was very in tune with how young people thought. As a matter of fact, one of the more poignant conversations we had together was towards the end of the run of the show. He said to me, well, actually it was after the show had finished. I had gone on to Fox. He said to me, you know, I'm worried about losing my creative juices. I said, what do you mean losing your creative juices? He said, well, you know, I have 5 children, as you know, and I'm really worried they're all reaching adulthood, and I don't know if I'll be as creative because so many of my ideas came from watching and listening to them. So that was an interesting, you know, he got a lot from them and would use springboards of ideas because they were so imaginative. But he really worried about his creativity being diminished when his children became adults.
Well, I was going to ask you a similar question, because you became a parent later, but a lot of these shows you were greenlighting or working on, I mean, what was the sensibility you think you had that made you get what kids would watch?
Because I always remembered my visceral reaction and emotional sentiment when I saw certain things in the movies or on television. For example, when I would watch Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I could see which was very scary. I watched it in the theater. But then when the monster, the creature of the Black Lagoon, was sneaking up on this boat in the swamp, I saw the seams of his costume, and I thought, oh, that's cool. That's a guy in there. I remember that, and so later, years later, when I was doing Power Rangers and everybody criticized me for how cheap it looked, I said, you don't get it. Kids like that. They're in on the joke. They know that's not a real pig from outer space eating up all the food, but they're in the moment, they're enjoying the action, and they get it. They like the hokiness. So part of it, my ability wasn't so brilliant. It was just a recall of how I felt when I was in the theater watching animation or watching scary movies. You know, one of the reasons I worked so hard, fought so hard to do Goosebumps as a series in television was because I loved scary movies as a kid. And I watched Alfred Hitchcock on TV, and I watched Twilight Zone and all those shows. As long as you don't forget what it's like when you were a child, you don't forget those emotions, the sky's the limit. You could always be in tune with your audience.
What was, where did the idea for Fraggle Rock come from? Was that something Henson had been working on?
Yes. Fraggle Rock had actually been a live-action show, and I'll tell you something interesting about Fraggle Rock. When we decided to do an animated version, I learned a lot about the show. I asked Jim, I said, Jim, when you got the idea for Fraggle Rock, there seems to me a greater substance underneath all this, but I don't understand what it is. There's something I can't put my finger on. He said, so I said, so what were you thinking when you created the show? He said, world peace. I said, what? He said, world peace. How do I foster world peace? I said, okay, let's talk about that. So in Fraggle Rock, Jim and his team created 3 layers of civilization. The upper layer with the giants, the middle layer and the lower layer with the, I can't remember the name of them.
Doozers.
Doozers, the doozers, thank you. So, and the doozers were the workers. But the key to the message of this show, through humor, was that those three civilizations were interconnected. Because he said, I wanted people to understand that what we do and decide to do today will have a rippling effect around the world, and you'll never know how much an effect that has. But that everything is connected. This was Jim's philosophy. It's all connected. The air we pollute today is going to hurt someone else tomorrow, someplace else, whatever it is. So that was the underlying purpose of Fraggle Rock. So when we did the animated series, which was wonderful, we really crystallized that even more without being, it wasn't preachy and it wasn't in your face, but we made sure that kids would see through every story the connections and how this being would connect this being and how they learned to live in harmony. Not always, there was a lot of humor in pratfalls, but that's what I admired about Jim so much. He was a real artist, but he was also always thinking about the impact that his shows, he just wanted to entertain. He was a filmmaker. First and foremost, Jim was a filmmaker. Before he was even a puppeteer, he was a filmmaker. But he wanted to make a difference. And that show, you know, when we did it for NBC, it was a hit, but it was only on 1 year.
Why do you think?
Oh, I know exactly why. And this is something that I learned. This was a lesson for me when I had my son late in life. The head of programming, the head person at NBC, I'm not going to mention names, because he was a wonderful man and very admired. His little girl did not like Fraggle Rock. And so when the Children's Programs Department wanted to renew the show, he didn't give the green light to it. That's just the way it goes. But and what I learned from that was, I thought to myself during that experience, if I ever have kids, I am not going to use them to be the determinant for what I decide to do professionally in a show, because it's not right. What one child thinks is not necessarily the reason to do something, especially if it's my child. I'll learn from my child if I ever have one, but I won't use that child as a rationale for buying or not buying shows.
Interesting. It's almost the opposite of what you would think. People in the
industry. It is the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that children don't inspire you. And my child, I learned from my child what he liked and disliked, but I didn't make decisions based on what he liked, because I remember that experience of wait a minute, how am I going to tell Jim Henson that his show's not being renewed because so-and-so doesn't like it? I didn't ever want to be in that position again.
I just want to back up and just talk about what Marvel was. Marvel Productions was the TV division of the comic book.
It was the film division of the comic book company. Mm-hmm. That's correct. This is in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And again, when I took this job, one of the reasons that it was so important that we got the Muppet Babies assignment and we were able to do that show is because we couldn't sell our other shows. We had in production a show for NBC, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which I can't take credit for. That was sold before I got there. But it was Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. So it wasn't really Spider-Man, because Spider-Man didn't have friends. Spider-Man, Peter Parker's a loner. As a comic book fan, I always felt it's like scraping your nails on a blackboard. It's not quite right. But that was the show that NBC wanted. So our company produced that. Then when I got there, we tried to sell all, X-Men was one of my favorites. Tried to sell that, weren't successful. Tried to sell a more authentic Spider-Man. We weren't successful. I tried to sell the Avengers. I wasn't successful. We tried to sell a lot of things. And we were most successful. We sold Dungeons and Dragons. That wasn't originally Marvel property. Muppet Babies. We sold a series of shows. And we developed and produced the original My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, Transformers, a lot of shows for Hasbro. They were a great client, but we were producing for syndication, not the networks. So of all my years at Marvel, while we were successful, I made it, or not just me, but it was more profitable during my run. And we certainly had big hits and big successes like Muppet Babies. At our peak, we had 400 employees. We were doing very well. We were great producers, but not of Marvel properties. So I really felt sort of like a failure. Having said that, I was very proud of the work we did. My corporation, the Marvel Comics, the Marvel Entertainment Group, and Jim Galton were very supportive of me. Stan Lee worked for me. I'll tell one quick story. One day I was in my office, and well, let me back up a minute. When Stan there had been a live-action production for primetime of Spider-Man years before, and it was not particularly successful. And some people think it was rather cheesy, but it was a production. I can't remember for what network. I want to say CBS, but I'm not sure about that. And the show was a big hit in Japan. The Japanese loved it. So fast forward to when we're at Marvel and I'm doing G.I. Joe and Transformers and all these shows, and we're using an animation studio in Japan called Toei. Toei, coincidentally, has the largest live-action production company at the time. So the head of the animation studio, or the live-action studio, Mr. Watanabe, knew Stan and admired him, and called him up one day and said, look, I've got a show that we've been doing, and it's very successful in Japan. I want to send it to you, and maybe you and your associate, Margaret, your boss, might be interested in doing it for the United States. So that was the backdrop. So Stan walked into my office one day with a 3/4-inch video cassette, and he says, Maggie, I think I've found a hit for us. I said, okay. He says, take a look, and he just put it on my desk. And it sat there a couple days, and finally I looked at it, and I walked down to his office. I said, Stan, you know that cassette you gave me, it was all in Japanese. He said, I know, but wasn't it funny? I said, well, as a matter of fact, it was. And I said, it was pretty crazy. And he says, yeah, well, why don't we, look, we can get the rights from Watanabe, and why don't we do something with it? And I said, okay, here's what we'll do. I'll authorize $25,000. Let's take the show and cut a trailer out of it, a presentation tape, and add U.S. voices and create the story, and we'll go out and present it. Now, we didn't have a name for, I don't remember what we called it. We had a name for it, an English name. I pitched it to all the networks, and one network executive pulled me aside and said, Margaret, outside of Stan's earshot, I can't believe you're pitching this to us. You, who've done Emmy award-winning programs like the Smurfs and Muppet Babies, how could you show me this crap? I'm like, she said, it's terrible, it's cheesy, it's violent, it's just, it's outrageous. I said, really? Because I think it's benign, and I think every kid wants to be a superhero. And I said, and the monsters are, when you say violent, the monsters are really silly. And I think it's kind of funny because it reminded me of the way I felt when I saw Creatures of the Black Lagoon. See how those moments in your life make a difference? So Stan and I pitched it to all 3 networks, and we were resoundingly sent our way and told, ugh, it's horrible. So Stan called Mr. Watanabe and said, I'm sorry, we haven't been successful. We'll relinquish the rights. Years later, several years later, when I was at Fox, I was with Haim Saban in his offices, and he had provided us, I was looking for a specific show. I needed a show for 7:30 in the mornings, Monday through Friday, to compete with all the comedy, Tom and Jerry kids, or Tom and Jerry, and all the shows that were out in syndication. And I looked at 3/4 of the stack of cassettes, and Haim stuck his head in and asked how I was doing, and I said, Stan, I'm sorry. I said, Haim, these shows are fine, they're cute, they're sweet. It was animation from around the world. I said, but this isn't what I need. He says, well, what do you need? And I said, well, I need something that's funny, but with action. Because I'm counter-programming, and 7:30 in the morning is a great time period, but I will only succeed if I have something really different and fun with action. He says, one moment, please, darling. And he raced out, and he came running back with a video cassette. He says, don't get mad at me, but take a look. You might like this. It might be what you're looking for. And I put that cassette on, and it was the exact same footage that Mr. Watanabe had sent us, that Stan had shown me. And that was the footage that we ultimately created Power Rangers out of that show. And it was a big hit, although nobody believed in it. I believed in it. Haim believed in it. Haim's wife believed in it. I don't think there were very many other people that believed in it. And certainly my bosses at Fox didn't believe in it. So that's a whole other story.
But they let you do it. I mean,
well, there's a story behind that.
mm-hmm.
At the time, Lucy Salhaney was chairman of Fox, and she was my boss. And there had been a lot of discussion around the town, around the company, around the business about this show. Margaret's Folly, as they refer to it. So we were producing the show. Well, first of all, what happened is when I first pitched the show to my boss at Fox, Jamie Kellner, who was president of Fox Network. Fox Kids was a wholly owned subsidiary. We were separate than the prime time, but we were a separate company, but he was my direct boss, and then Rupert. Jamie, I had the authority to greenlight series as long as they were consistent with my budget. But Jamie wouldn't let me greenlight Power Rangers. He thought it was terrible. But he said to me, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. Shoot a pilot. We didn't shoot pilot. We didn't have the money for pilots and kids programming. Shoot a pilot and test it. And if it tests well, I'll let you do it. I said, I don't have the budget for a pilot. He says, I'll give you $100,000. I thought, okay. So I walked out of there thinking, 100,000, what am I going to do? So I called up Haim, and I told him the truth. I said, Jamie doesn't like it. He doesn't think it'll work, but he's given me a challenge. If we can do a pilot and prove that kids like it, then they'll let me greenlight it. And I said, but I don't have enough money. And I said, how much have you got? I said, 100,000. He says, I'll put in 100.
Wow.
So we did a pilot, and we only had enough money to do 17 minutes. So it wasn't even a full pilot. And then we tested it. And I watched the kids behind the glass at the testing. And of course, the little boys went crazy. But that's not when I knew it would be a hit. I knew it would be a hit when there were two little girls in the room with them. There were girls in the room, and a couple little girls were talking. And one little girl said, I love the Pink Ranger. And the other little girl said, well, I like the Yellow Ranger. And then the first little girl said, well, I like both of them because they kick butt. This is what the little kids were saying. And I said, it's a hit.
So
done. So I went back to Jamie, and I told him the results. And he says, I think it's a big mistake. Big mistake. So how much are you going to pay him in a license fee? And I had almost no money. He said, I told him, he said, well, how are you going to get the show for that amount of money? I said, I don't know, but I'll figure it out. So I went to Haim, and I said, okay, I can order the show, but I can only pay $15,000 an episode. He says, what? I said, sorry, and I want a piece of the merchandising for the company. And Haim stepped up, to his credit. I even have a recollection that he told me he had mortgaged his house, which mortified me. But we both believed in it. Well, we had no idea it would become the hit that it was, but we thought it would be successful. obviously later when it was a hit, we renegotiated that deal. But people ask me all the time why I thought it would work. And I thought it would work because I remembered what it was like to be a kid. And then I thought, what kid wouldn't want to turn into a superhero? I mean, didn't we all dream of that? I dreamed of being Wonder Woman as a child. Today it's a big hit. But anyway, that's the story of that project. And it started with Stan Lee at Marvel. Stan was the first person to really recognize the attributes of that show.
Yeah, I want to go back to Stan. Did you know much about him, and what was his involvement with Marvel at the time you came on board?
Well, Stan was, I don't remember Stan's title at Marvel, maybe executive vice president, because Stan doesn't really need a lot. But Stan had been in New York and asked when they created Marvel Productions if he could come out and work for Marvel Productions, because he was very interested in film and television. So when I got the job offer to go become president and CEO of Marvel, I took Stan Lee to lunch. And I had known Stan at Hanna-Barbera because we'd gotten the rights to do The Thing. And Joe Barbera thought Stan Lee was a nut. And actually, I think Stan would laugh at this now. Joe used to refer to Stan as the cuckoo bird, because Stan was, you know, very gregarious and outgoing and energetic. So I knew him and I'd admired him, but I didn't know him well. So I got to Marvel and I thought, well, the first thing I need to do is take Stan to lunch. Had that kind of conversation that I'd had with Friz Freleng and Walter Lantz and Joe Barbera in my early days, and tell him I'm a fan and I have a lot to learn from him. And so I took him to lunch and I said, Stan, I just want you to know, I know on paper I'm your boss, but I'm not really your boss. You don't really work for me. If anything, I'm honored to be your partner. He said to me, Maggie, you can be my boss any day of the week. As a matter of fact, I only have one rule. And if you follow this rule, we're going to get along famously. And I said, what? What, Stan, tell me what your rule is. He says, when we go to lunch and I order dessert, don't you ever ask to eat any of my dessert. That was his rule. And the funny thing about that was, later on when we go to lunch with clients, and he'd always order dessert because he loves them, and I'd see the network executive with their spoon start to say, Stan, I'd go, no, you can't have any of Stan's dessert. That was Stan's rule. So, you know, he's a man with an ego, but he's also very modest. He's humble in his own way. And he was wonderful. I really enjoyed him, and we became great friends while I was at Marvel, but we became more successful friends when I was at Fox. Because when I went to Fox, I called up Stan, and I said, okay, Stan, we couldn't sell the shows that you and I both believed in when I was with Marvel, but now I'm running a network. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do X-Men first.
And he had told you that that was the one that he wanted to develop the most? Is that the story with X-Men?
Well, Stan and I would have long discussions when I was at Marvel about his favorite characters. Mm-hmm. And I remember going into him one day and asking him, I mean, obviously Spider-Man is his favorite. But he talked a lot about X-Men because he loved X-Men. And one day I was talking to him and he was saying, he didn't say these words, but it added up to the way I took it. I said, I get it. It's about disenfranchised teens. He said, well, I've never quite thought of it that way, but yes, it's kids who are different, and they're being ostracized and punished because they're different. And he said, every kid, including me, felt like an awkward kid, and we didn't feel we belonged, and we were mortified when we go to school every day, and we stuck out, and we didn't know where we belonged. And that was his inspiration for X-Men. So we had talked so much about it, that's why I said to him, the first show we'll do is X-Men. And then we're going to do Spider-Man, and then we had other properties to do. So when we started Fox, I waited one season because we had so much to get done, and then I told my boss, I'm gonna order X-Men, and he said, And I was really taken aback. I said, well, I thought I had green light authority here and I could make the creative decisions. He said, Margaret, I think that X-Men is a mistake. Why do you believe in it so much? And I told him all the reasons. He says, well, I don't know, I don't really. He says, and I don't see any enthusiasm from you. And I said, well, my enthusiasm is for the shows, not for, I really believe in it. And so he thought it was a mistake. He thought that, again, a comic book, maybe it was too esoteric. I can't remember all the reasons he didn't like it. But he said to me, okay, Margaret, I'll let you do it, but you understand if it doesn't work, it's not going to work for us together here. He said, are you willing to put that much behind the show? And I said, yeah. And then after that discussion, I went in with Power Rangers, and that's when he said no. And so X-Men came out first, and we went from being the 4th network to #1 with X-Men. And then months later, I premiered Power Rangers, and we went from #1 to the stratosphere. And it was 2 shows that nobody believed in, that the industry didn't believe in, and yet they just didn't understand what kids liked, in my opinion.
So, I mean, again, we've talked about it, but what's the secret sauce between you and Stan that predicted that kids would resonate with these shows, that no one else could see who was doing this? Two things immediately come to mind. First of all, X-Men had been a successful comic for over 20 years. And I felt that Stan had created something that clearly had legs, and that the storytelling in it was so rich, and the characters were so rich. You know, they weren't perfect characters. They didn't all get along, just like a group of kids, young, teenagers. And I think the secret sauce, and by the way, the same as the Power Rangers. Every kid wants to be a superhero at one time in their lives, or more. And I think the secret sauce is that Stan and I have stayed conscious or in touch with what we liked as kids and what we see other kids like. It's basic elements. Don't you walk into a room sometimes and you just want to hide because you feel like I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I don't fit, I don't belong. Everybody feels that way at one time or another. So if you put it into programming, people recognize themselves. There's something they can relate to. So it's just not forgetting. You just have to be mindful of those human emotions, and I think you can succeed. Now sometimes, we were wrong, but when it really counted, we were right. And Stan and I, philosophically, share a lot of common beliefs. We've always hit it off. And I think one of the reasons that I always responded to Stan is I had curiosity and he had enthusiasm. And it was a good combination. You mentioned the 2 little girls in the testing
yes.
group, and there's really strong female characters in both of those
Correct.
programs. Was that an active effort to introduce?
Absolutely. Because part of my quest, I guess, is to prove that little girls liked action adventure as much as boys. We didn't show it as much. We didn't go out and buy action figures like boys. We didn't even play like boys. But from a story perspective, girls like action, girls like suspense, girls like mysteries, girls like special effects. And nobody could have been more gratified when Wonder Woman came out and was a hit than yours truly, because it proved exactly what I felt and had been saying for years. And so Power Rangers was considered a boy show, but it had strong girl appeal. And as a matter of fact, our audience breakdown was that at least 40% of the audience were girls. X-Men was the same. X-Men is very literate in many ways. You know, there had been many versions of X-Men by the time we put the show in the air, but what I said to Stan and what he agreed with is, let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to the original X-Men and do that show. Bring it up to speed, but do that show, because that's where it all started, with the original characters, and that's what we did. Yeah. I think it's just paying attention to the voice in your head and then studying what kids are doing or people are doing now.
Did you ever formulate your own sort of guidance or philosophy, or felt a responsibility to define what responsible programming for children?
Oh, big time.
What would that be?
Well, let me start with just laying out the climate of what the 80s and 90s were like. We were under tremendous scrutiny. It actually started in the late 60s, early 70s. The kids industry was really being criticized a great deal for violence and commercial content. Mm-hmm. There was a woman named Peggy Charon that created a group. She was from Massachusetts, as I recall. She was a wonderful lady. We turned out to be great friends and admirers, but we were often on the other side of the table from each other. And Peggy was convinced that television had become nothing but commercials to sell toys to kids. Mm-hmm. And she believed that young children could not tell the difference between programming and commercials. They couldn't tell where it began and where it ended. So if you're watching a show, Scooby-Doo, and then you go to commercial, the kids still think they're watching Scooby-Doo. Now, I challenged that because I've always felt that we didn't give kids enough credit. That's part of my personal belief. But I also felt that, you know, Peggy really had created some interesting statements and was critical of the toy industry in particular, trying to make commercials seem like programming. Now, I thought that was, she might be onto something. So in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I was a frequent guest of Washington, D.C. in front of Senate and congressional subcommittees testifying. I wasn't alone, but in the 90s, when we were number one, we were really scrutinized. We were criticized. Power Rangers was criticized for violence. X-Men was criticized for violence. Batman, the animated show, which was one of my favorites, we developed it consistent with the original comic book vision of being dark. Mm-hmm. So we were criticized for that. That was with Warner Brothers. They did a fabulous job. So I would say that I always developed a sense of responsibility. I always understood that kids could imitate violence. So I did believe in the rule that if there was something that was easily imitatable by a child, we shouldn't do it. But it was fantastic, it's okay. I also very early on believed that that kids would respond to positive messages if you presented them either subtly or you were on the nose with little, like in the G.I. Joe, we'd have little 30-second interstitials that Hasbro agreed to do, which I thought I pushed for, where we would just nail it. It would be 30 seconds based on any number of things. Kids don't do this or do this, little tidbits of positive information. And by the way, today, when I talk to millennials, they remember, or older, X generation, mm-hmm. they talk about how much they learned from those shows in a positive way and how much they liked them. So my philosophy was, if the violence wasn't imitatable, it was okay, because kids want to be excited, just like adults who watch all kinds of programming. Kids are no different. They want a variety of things. But I did always feel very responsible, and as a matter of fact, there's some things that we did at Fox and everywhere that I'm really proud of. At Fox, John Walsh was a big star of Fox primetime. So I went to John and said, John, I'd like to create something where you're on camera, but we have some sort of little vignette that we shoot to teach kids about safety, all kinds of safety. And we did create this series that was very successful with this little vignette where you'd see, for example, you'd see a little boy walking down the street, and a guy in a convertible would pull over to the side and say, I'm looking for my puppy. Can you help me find my puppy? Come on, get in the car with me and we'll go look for my puppy. And then John Walsh would step into the scene and say, So we did a series of those vignettes, and I got several interesting letters, one from a police officer in Pennsylvania, I don't remember the town, where a little girl had gone to her teacher to talk about how she was being molested by a family member. Well, we had a vignette that said, if anybody is making you feel comfortable, if they touch you in any way, you go tell a trusted adult, someone you trust, like a teacher or someone. And so the little girl did that and reported it to the police. We got another we had a spot in Power Rangers, at the end of Power Rangers, or in the where we told kids how if they, I can't remember the specifics, but it was to duck your head, how to roll if something hit you and you were falling. We got a letter from a father whose son was hit by an ice cream truck, flew through the air, missed the curb, fortunately, but he rolled, and when the paramedics came, and they discovered he was only knocked his breath out of him, but he was perfectly fine, and the little boy said, I learned this on the Power Rangers, I tucked my head. So I know that for a fact that there are things that we can do that are effective, and that's where I felt we shouldn't water down our programming, but we should enrich our programming by adding things like that to it.
Is that part of the public service campaign that won Fox the Peabody?
Yes.
What did that honor mean?
Yes. Oh, it was wonderful.